Last but by no means least is our keynote speaker. In seeking a keynote speaker for today, I consulted with Dr. Holly Mayer. She's arguably the nation's leading scholar on U.S. early American history. She's a professor emerita at Duquesne University, a retired history department chair there for 2 terms, and she currently is she's serving as the prestigious Charles Bowl Ewing Visiting Professor of History at the United States Military Academy, that is West Point. I asked her if she might speak. She said that she might, but that she is to talk about Western Pennsylvania colonial times, and quite frankly, she said there's someone more eminently qualified to do that than I am. I recognize this is one of the most eminently qualified scholars in the world on colonial times. And so she highly recommended, before she might consider this, our keynote speaker. Little did I realize our keynote speaker is a Grove City High School baseball coach. And I wondered why he wasn't practicing with his team, but I was glad there was snow here today because maybe they can't practice yet. I'd like to read through his qualifications, if I may, and not to bore you, but this is customary. Our keynote speaker has an undergraduate degree and a master's degree in history from Slippery Rock University. He has a PhD from Kent State University. His areas of expertise and research are colonial revolutionary America, American Indian history, the Civil War, Pennsylvania history, Pittsburgh history, and U.S. military history. His publications, and just listening to them, you get a flavor for why Dr. Mayer suggested him. A Colony Sprung from Hell, Pittsburgh and the Struggle for Authority on the Western Pennsylvania Front, 1744 to 1794. That was a Kent State University Press book. The Boundaries Between U.S. Natives and Newcomers on the Frontiers of the Old Northwest Territory. That was a 2006 Kent State University book. A third book, Unconquered, the Iroquois League at War in Colonial America. That Prager published that. And not to mention, I'm not going to list them all, but just 3 that are germane historic articles written for historic journals. Victory at Kittanning, Reevaluating the Impact of Armstrong's Raid on the 7 Years' War in Pennsylvania. That was in the Pennsylvania Magazine of History and Biography. And here's one more. A Road for Warriors, the Western Delawares and the 7 Years' War in Pennsylvania. That was a publication in Pennsylvania History. When we talked about what he might talk about, I said, pardon my language, whatever the hell you want to talk about. We're truly honored to have him here, and he accepted readily. And so, ladies and gentlemen, may I present to you the university, not just professor, this is a university professor of history at Robert Morris University, Dr. Daniel P. Barr.
Well, thank you for that very kind introduction. Really makes me wish my mother-in-law was in the crowd. Might change her opinion of me a little bit. No, I jest. But thanks very much to Paul and the Richland History Group, all of you, for inviting me to speak, and thank you for coming out to hear me. I think both the first two presenters covered a lot of ground for me that I can now kind of stream over and maybe fill in some stuff on the peripheries or the background a little bit. Certainly you'll hear about George Washington a little bit. But I'm going to start primarily with talking about what was going on out here. And the title in the program is really probably more reflective than what I have on the screen. I've done various versions of this talk. It's based on a title I take from a pamphlet of inhabitants at the end of the Revolution around here that they sent to the Continental Congress to complain about lack of protection and no presence of government. And they said, we're living on the ends of the American earth. I think I'll have the fuller quote here for you in a minute. Had to dig my way out this morning. I live a little bit north, right along some of the areas that Ginny was talking about. I live very close to Grove City, kind of between Grove City and Mercer. So I found her talk very enlightening and appealing in that regard, because honestly, nobody really up my way knows anything about Washington being there. So, hopefully that'll change maybe as time goes forward. But I had to dig my way out to get down here. Got a lot of snow and ice up my way, so I might roam a little bit. Hopefully you can hear me. My back gets stiff. I'm a little junked up in the lower back area from shoveling, so I might have to roam a little bit. Hopefully I won't get out of frame of the camera, and hopefully you can all hear me. I'm used to usually talking to students who we manage to ram into much larger rooms than this in ever-increasing numbers. So usually my voice carries, but hopefully that'll be the case here today. All right, I started to say I shoveled my way out. One of the repercussions of that is I had some notes to guide me so I wouldn't have to look back at the screen too much, and I left them at my house. So they were just guide notes anyways, just to kind of keep me on path. But if I turn away, you'll see I have quite a few contemporary quotes in here from individuals and participants. I think sometimes their words tell it better than my words can. So hopefully it won't be too boring as I turn around to read from the screen a little bit. All right. What you see on the screen is a picture, an artist drawing of Fort Pitt, kind of at its height. And the way I start this is the way I open my book that I wrote on this topic. And that is, in the year 1784, at the end of the 1782, at the end of the Revolution, the Continental Army commander for the Western Department, which was based out of Pittsburgh at Fort Pitt, was a guy named William Irvine. And Irvine was sitting in his office, if you want to call it that, in the one bastion of Fort Pitt, mulling over correspondence, particularly a petition that he had just received from the local inhabitants. Now, it was signed by over 500 people, and the crux of it, what it said was, towards the end, it says, living as it were here, on the ends of the American earth, we have to a great degree been neglected by our brethren beyond the mountains. Our new government that we're fighting for, this new nation, they're saying, you've neglected us out here on the frontier. It says our neighbors, our sons, our daughters, our fathers, and those to whom we are most nearly related, in every valley, in almost every hill, river, stream within the line of settlement, have been slaughtered in their homes, and a great tract of country on all sides is wholly laid waste. They're referencing the war of the Revolution, which in this part of the world was a war against Indian peoples. And that war had not gone well, in large part, for settlers out here. And so the people here on the other side of the mountains were not, fighting a revolution because of British taxation or liberty. They were fighting a revolution that was based on a contest over land. And they were fighting primarily against Indian peoples, but as we'll see, also at the same time, against each other. Because there were two distinct settler regions in this, in this area. One kind of dominated by Virginians, the other by Pennsylvanians. And when I wrote this book on this topic, which I'll reference here at the end, if you're interested in a deeper, look at this, what I really wanted to do was to write a military history of the American Revolution on the Western frontier. And as I was starting to do my research, I kept coming across things, correspondence of Army commanders like Irvine and others, very prevalent in their correspondence were complaints and concern over the local inhabitants. And it became clear as I read it that the inhabitants were very factionalized, organized into two separate groups, and that those groups were competing with each other. And it was having such a dramatic impact on the war of the Revolution that I wanted to find, where did this come from? What was the root of it? This competition between Virginians and Pennsylvanians, or what this land, whose colony was it really going to be? Was it going to be Pennsylvania or was it going to be Virginia? And it took me all the way back, more than 40 years, into the 1740s, to find the roots of this competition between Virginians and Pennsylvanians that doesn't end until really the Whiskey Rebellion in many regards, and if then, really. You can even see relevance to it, relevance or parts of it playing in the War of 1812 in terms of labor that was recruited from this area that went north to build Commodore Perry's fleet at Presque Isle. Those camps had to be segregated basically between residents of certain counties, Washington County or Allegheny County, because of the lingering Pittsburgh, Virginia divide. They still didn't get along with each other, even that far after this. So what I'm going to outline for you here is just kind of that story, with most of my highlights going to be in the early portions of that story, in this time period that we're looking at when Washington made this journey. But I'll take it in briefer form up through the Revolution and then conclude it. All right? But it starts for me, like I said, with Irvine, getting this petition. These people are very unhappy. They say, telling him the government has neglected us. This Continental Congress, this new nation has not protected us out here. They've left us to be slaughtered by the Indians. And then the petition goes on to say, you've done this even though it's us, the local settlers here, that are standing between you in the east, standing between you and the tomahawk and the scalping knife. These people say, we've been dying out here, and we've been providing basically a bulwark, a fortification against the Indians from coming over the mountains like they did during the French and Indian War and slaughtering or raiding into the east. And what they wanted was basically a reward. They wanted to be compensated for this. And what they wanted was to be recognized in land. And we'll get into exactly what they wanted here towards the end. Now Irvine, this is the part where they talk about, we hope our brethren will come to understand what it is to see our fellow men, our helpless women and children every week and every hour in their houses, in their fields, lying hacked by the tomahawk, scalped and hurting. And they will consider what it is every moment to be under apprehension of this kind of death. Doesn't paint a very happy picture. And this is an unhappy local population. And they wanted Irvine basically to do something about it. And we'll talk about what they wanted. In particular, they wanted him to recognize a certain colony over another as being the rightful possessors of the land around here. Now, Irvine was not unsympathetic. Okay? Not unsympathetic, but he has also been through a number of disputes and struggles with the local leaders in this area over his 3 years at Fort Pitt. And he wrote to his wife, voluminous writer, especially to his wife. He wrote, while he was sympathetic to their plight and their suffering, he said, there never was, nor will I ever hope there ever will be, such a wretched, villainous place as this. He said, I do not remember any part of my life spent to so little purpose as present. Now that comes from his frustration over dealing with this factionalized local population, which had cried repeatedly over and over for protection and defenses against the Indians, but in Irvine's estimation, done nothing but undercut every effort to protect them because of their disputes along factionalized lines. And that's what we'll get into, like I said, here a little bit. He called this, in summing it up, he said to his wife, he said, this area, western Pennsylvania, is the most unaccountable country and inhabitants in the world. As I said, when I first started to research this, I was focusing on the War of the American Revolution. I wanted to see how it happened out here. But I was struck as I worked my way back trying to find the origins of this Virginia-Pennsylvania dispute that almost 20 years to the day prior to Irvine writing these comments to his wife, Henry Bouquet, the Swiss-born British commander sitting in Fort Pitt in the aftermath of the French and Indian War, really in the aftermath of Pontiac's rebellion, he was writing in his journal, and he expressed very similar sentiments. And he summed it up by saying, this region is a colony sprung from hell for the scourge of mankind. And again, he's somebody who had to deal with this chaos and disorder that was brought about by these two factionalizing groups. And like I said, the origin even goes back further than that. It really goes back to before the French and Indian War. And that's where we'll start. And when we look, we've heard a lot about Washington and did a great job really bringing in the background of the French and Indian War about this. I have a little bit to say about it as well, but particularly I want to focus a little bit more on the various groups that were interested in this region. Okay? When we look at what they're after here, it's really the green area over here under Lake Erie, okay? The interior of the continent. And whether it's for trading with Indians or land settlement or both, that's where the future wealth or opportunities to make money lies, beyond the mountains. And by the 1740s, it's starting to draw the attention of many different interested groups or even nations. On the one hand, of course, we have the French. They perhaps, at least among Europeans or Euro-Americans, had the oldest claim, dating back to the travels and explorations of LaSalle back in the 1680s, who had come down Lake Ontario crossed over the Niagara River to what is now Erie, to Presque Isle, over down what is still named French Creek, portaged across to the Allegheny, eventually all the way down the Ohio into the Mississippi, claiming all the lands in that region, especially to the north and west, in the name of France. Now, the French hadn't done much beyond that, other than some trade activities in the Great Lakes region, but they still held that old claim. They considered that to be part of Nouveau Francais, of New France. Now, on the other hand, you have the British. And we want to be more specific about that because the British government at this time doesn't have much of an interest in this land around the Ohio River at all. In fact, when news of Washington's skirmish at Jumonville reaches Parliament, the famous British essayist and Parliament member Horace Walpole objects to a call for war, saying, are we going to bring on this war for these literal words are, will we bring on war for the sake of a river that none of us have ever seen nor likely ever will, back there in London. So really, when we look at the British side of this, the British, who on the British side is trying to force their way into the Ohio country and take this up, it's actually British colonies. Pennsylvania, on the one hand, has been moving traders primarily towards the forks of the Ohio River, Pittsburgh, and even established themselves in some places well beyond in what we would now think of as Ohio. At the same time, we've got Virginians starting to come up. They're also interested in the forks of the Ohio River and all the lands behind. Now, why do we have Virginians, you might ask, coming up here? We'll get into that in a second. It has to do everything to do with the colonial charter. But these two groups, you'd think they'd be on the same side, but they weren't. Not for 45 years. They were pretty much constantly opposed to each other in trying to take control of the region around the Ohio forks and much of what becomes especially southwestern Pennsylvania. And not last, but certainly not least, are the Indian peoples, many of whom had migrated to the region beginning in the 1720s and were continuing to do so right up until the start of the French Indian War in the 1750s. This area of western Pennsylvania, or the upper Ohio River Valley, had once been inhabited, but for probably the better part of 2 centuries had been largely abandoned by Indian peoples until various groups from the east started to migrate over the mountains and reestablish themselves along this region, all of whom were migrants, refugees basically, forced out of their original lands back in the east, come over the mountains to kind of reconstitute themselves, rebuild their lives on this side of the Appalachian Mountains. Now, what they all were after, as I tried to told you, is what people at this time generally simply refer to as the Ohio country. Yes, it's a big part of it's the modern state of Ohio. But it also, as you'll see here, encapsulates pretty much a lot of western Pennsylvania, especially the Allegheny River watershed. In fact, for most of this time, when you look on a map, they don't differentiate between the Allegheny and the Ohio. It's just one river. I mean, in many cases it really is, but they don't care about renaming it once you get beyond the junction with the Monongahela. It's still just the Allegheny River. So it's really this greater upper Ohio rivershed is what they're interested in. And the primary importance of this region, of course, is the forks of the Ohio. Whoever controlled that region would control access into the interior. No roads, obviously. The paths that we've heard about, Jenny did a great job describing the width. They're very mediocre or, very pedestrian. You're not going to move large quantities of goods or even people along these paths. So what you need is water. And if you can control the access route to the Ohio River, then you can control basically the entire Ohio country. It was almost destined by geography and fate that where Pittsburgh now sits was going to become a place of great importance one way or another. Now, I want to start off by talking about these 4 various groups. I want to talk about the Indians first. Right? And here we define them as the Western Indians, just to differentiate them from, especially in terms of Delaware Indians, from ones still living in the eastern part of Pennsylvania. But all the Indians who inhabited this area at the start of the French Indian War, even the time that George Washington makes his trek up through here, came from somewhere else. None were original to the region. The original peoples, the Monongahelans and some others, had long since left the region and migrated down the Ohio River during, what historical geologists term the Little Ice Age, basically a period of global cooling that made it difficult to grow crops consistently in southwestern Pennsylvania. You need I'm not a farmer by any means, but you need about 90 days of frost-free weather to successfully farm in this part of the world. And there was a time in the late 1400s into the 1500s where it actually got cold enough that you didn't get 90 days of frost-free weather. And it's also at that time that the archaeological record reveals that people who had once lived in this region were gone. They'd went somewhere else. Right? So the peoples who we think of being native to this region, and the ones of which a lot of this place is named after in the Algonquian language, are newcomers, really. They're refugees from points in the east. And the largest in terms of population, and arguably the most significant of those groups, were the Delawares, or the Lenni Lenape, original people in their own language. But in English history, American history, we call them the Delawares, largely because they once lived on either side of the river that bears their name. They get that name, by the way, in 1612, when a little exploration village out of Jamestown, Virginia, the little tiny colony of Jamestown, came up the Delaware Bay and explored a little bit of the river. And at that time, the current governor of Jamestown was the Lord de la Warr. And so Thomas West, the Lord de la Warr, so they called everything in his honor, de la Warr, which becomes at some point shortened, condensed into Delaware. So these Indians, historically, we generally refer to them as Delawares. They still do themselves today. If you look up the Delaware Indians website, and all Indian nations have a website if you're not familiar with that, you can look it up and it will say the Delaware Tribe of Indians. And then it will say Lenni Lenape at the bottom, which is their name in their language. But as far as English, it's Delawares. Well, long story short, when William Penn founded his colony, he founded it upon the principles of maintaining peace, treating the Indians as equals. We would live together as one people, is what he told them. But William Penn didn't spend a whole lot of time in Pennsylvania. Only basically a grand total of about 4 years. Most of his life was spent back in England. And when he died in 1718 and his sons and heirs took over, they had a different interpretation of how that should work. And it's at that time, in the 1720s and 30s, that pressure really starts to get heavily applied on Indian lands in the east. And it leads to a migration of the Delawares. First, up the Susquehanna River to the Forks, where they build a settlement called Shamokin. And then a portion, not all of the Delawares, but a portion of the Delawares breaks away and continues to migrate, eventually coming over the mountains, down the other side, and settling or establishing the settlement of Kittanning, which in the Algonquian language basically means placed by the great stream, or placed by the water. From Kittanning, they spread out keep hitting the wrong thing, I apologize. They spread out north and south along the Allegheny and Ohio rivers, founding numerous villages kind of in this general watershed area. Now, the Delawares were not the only ones. At a similar time frame, you had a group of people known as the Shawnees, who are, their history is one of migration as far as we can tell, even in their oral tradition. Shawnee is a word that in some connotations basically means people who wander, because they had once been in the Carolinas. They probably originated in the Ohios, then they've been in what is now the Carolinas. By the 1720s and 30s, there was a large number of Shawnees along the Pennsylvania-Maryland border. But just as the Delawares were pressured and started to leave, so too did the Shawnees, moving along a different route through the mountains, but arriving here at the forks of the Ohio. Now from here, the Shawnees mostly moved down the Ohio River, especially along the Scioto River in what is now Ohio. But you would have Shawnee settlements and villages stretching back as far as the hook of the Ohio River, overlapping in some places with Delawares in some points. And then lastly, of the major Indian groups in this region were Mingos. Mingos are not Algonquian peoples like Shawnees and Delawares. They are Iroquoians. And they were people who were probably, Mingos are hard to trace. There's still a great deal of debate about their origin. Not to get too far off track, but Mingos at this time were part of the Seneca Nation, one of the 6 nations of the Iroquois Confederacy. But they were originally probably Susquehannocks, who had been conquered overrun by the Iroquois in the 1660s and largely pulled out of central Pennsylvania up into New York and assimilated into the Iroquois Confederacy. Within the Seneca tribe, there was always a subdivision of Senecas called basically translates into English as dark or black Minquas, from which the word Mingo comes. It was just a way of differentiating them from other Senecas. So there's a fair amount of information available to suggest that these Mingos who start leaving the Genesee region of the Finger Lakes of western New York are actually descendants of the once Susquehannock tribe that once inhabited the central part of Pennsylvania. But whether they are or they're not, what happens is they too move, coming down the Allegheny River, establishing themselves eventually kind of along the PA-Ohio line. Now these zones are not, these kind of shaded zones I have here where Indians lived are not necessarily mutually exclusive, meaning you could find a Mingo village intermixed with a Delaware village, same thing with Shawnees. And we heard about Logstown, the big meeting center, all that. And that was very much a mixed village. where you'd have Mingos, Shawnees, Delawares, etc. And you get a person like the Half King, who was a Seneca. His role officially, his power base, was to basically come with these Mingos and act as an intermediary for the Iroquois Central Council back in New York. Although he often more not identified, his actions identified him much more with the people he was supposed to be governing than with the council that had supposedly appointed him. But you have these three major groups. And you read some books, and for a long time they kind of said they're all mixed together. Now that's true, but only to a certain extent. There are villages of Indians in this region that are particularly all Delawares. Katanning was a Delaware clearinghouse, basically. Kuskoskis is all Delawares. Venango is Munsee, Wolf clan, Delawares. Those are not mixed villages. But the further closer you get down here to what's now the modern line and into the hook of the Ohio River, you get a lot more mixing in terms of the villages and the Indians living in proximity with one another. And when you heard in some of the earlier talks about, well, you wouldn't take those Indians, they wouldn't go that way because they don't get along with those other tribes, that's some of what's at work here. It's not all the same Indians living here. It's at least three different groups. Now, mixed in this, you also have some other smaller, migrant tribes, whether it's Mohicans or Conestogas or whatever. But these are the three major ones. These are the ones that have the most impact on the region and the most well documented historically. Now, we look at these Indians. I told you they're all refugees. Okay? The best account we have, or the best we know about in terms of refugees, comes from the Delawares. Right? And we call these ones the Western Delawares because there's plenty of Delawares who stayed at Shamokin on the east side of the mountains, but these ones who come over the west did so for a reason, or for multiple reasons. And a lot of it had to do with land policies, changing land policies in Pennsylvania that they were no longer willing to accept or comfortable with. In particular, we're talking about the walking purchase of 1737. All right, in this era, one of the sons of William Penn authorized his lieutenant, this provincial secretary of Pennsylvania, to buy a chunk of land along the Delaware River. Those negotiations did not proceed very well. The Delawares in that region were not particularly interested in selling the land. So what happens is this guy Logan produces a document attributed ostensibly to being a treaty signed between William Penn and Delaware leaders during the early times when William Penn was actually in the colony. This is a photograph of, it's hard to see, a photograph of the actual treaty document. Now in the document, it allegedly says, or it does say, the document says that the Delaware tribe would agree to sell to Pennsylvania, to William Penn or his heirs, enough land or as much land as an individual could cover in 24 hours, in one day, walking purchase. Now from there, it's very controversial. The treaty itself, many historians have poked holes in, have argued that it's a fabrication, that it's a fraud, that it was not actually ever enacted by William Penn. But even if you take it as being a valid treaty that had been signed, the way that it is implemented causes a lot of controversy. The Indians will argue when this is all done that what the treaty said was as much land as a man could walk in a day. They did not define a day as 24 hours. It was sun up to sundown. They believed that should be without any kind of assistance, and they believed, that would be the thing. What the Penn family did under their provincial secretary, William Logan, is Logan hired basically what we would think of as a team of professional runners. And then they prepared the way. They actually cleared debris, trees, made a path. And these men ran as like a relay race for 24 hours. And they ran from the Delaware River, from what's now Wrightstown, in the diagonal line. And the treaty basically said that whatever distance they got out would be mirrored. So you have the mirror on the north and south, and it cut out this chunk of land right here. And see, here you see a better breakdown. This is the route of the so-called walkers. 55 miles covered in basically 18 daylight hours. The land cession, the walking purchase as it's called, wound up being about 12 million square acres. It's about, or miles rather, it's about the same, not miles, acres. It's about the same size as the state of Rhode Island. Now, Delawares protested this. They refused to leave. They said this was fraudulent. This was not done as it was. But the Pennsylvania government brought in the Iroquois Confederacy from New York. who at this time, because of an alliance between several British colonies and the Iroquois, was known as the Covenant Chain, was basically recognized the Iroquois as being the kind of ultimate arbiter for every Indian tribe east of the Mississippi River. In other words, if you're a British colony and you want Indian land, you're having some problem acquiring it from them, you bring in the Iroquois. They will arbitrate the situation. Why the Iroquois? Because, as I tell you with the Susquehannocks, in the mid-1600s, about 1650s to 1670s, they had engaged in a series of wars, sometimes remembered or called the Beaver Wars, in which they had appropriated not just land, but people from many neighboring Indian tribes, including some in Pennsylvania. And they used that to enact this alliance, the Covenant Chains Alliance, which starts with the colony of New York, but Pennsylvania becomes a member in the 1700s, to kind of position themselves as the Iroquois as the #1 Indian nation in colonial America. And when you look at the fate of Native peoples in colonial America, no one holds on to their lands as long or as completely as the Iroquois Confederacy. Because what they do is they become very good at giving away other Indian lands to protect their own. And they don't fail until they turn against themselves in the American Revolution, which for them is a civil war as much as anything else. Okay, but here back in 1737, the Iroquois come in, they tell the Delawares, basically they call them their nephews. Okay? In native parlance, fathers, sons, brother, it all matters what you're called. Okay? William Penn was called by the Delawares Brother Miquon, which means Algonquian is pen, literally like the writing implement pen. Okay? But they called him Brother Miquon, brother, equal. Okay? French were the French father, not in the sense of ruler, but in the sense of having certain obligations. Fathers and children have mutual reciprocal obligations in treaties. But they called the Iroquois, called the Delawares nephew. Nephew means subordinate, means you're basically ruled by us. And they said, nephews, we have not given you permission to enter into any treaties with the colony of Pennsylvania. Basically saying, you cannot speak for yourselves. We speak for you. As such, you have no right to contest this. And the Iroquois ruled in favor of Pennsylvania and basically threatened the Delawares in that region with war if they did not remove. So they did. They become among those peoples migrating. Whoops. I can use that. Migrating up the Susquehanna. But when they get here, these remnants or these people came out of here, out of that walking purchase area. They decided it's not far enough. They said, what will stop Pennsylvania from doing the same thing here to us that they did there? So they decide to break away from the main Delaware group and go over the mountains and start over, establishing themselves basically as the western Delawares as opposed to the eastern Delawares who remain behind. And there are many other Delawares who think as they do, who may not have been involved in the walking purchase. And it's not one mass migration, it's a trickle. It really starts right after the walking purchase and is still going on really in the early 1750s. They come first into Kittanning. So that kind of becomes a clearinghouse, a place where they might stay for a little while, and then they will move with their clans or their groups, eventually establishing villages. These are just a couple, Venango, Kaskaskis, Sakunk. You heard about those earlier, and there's many, many more. All right, and then they mix, as we talked about a little bit, on occasion in certain places with Shawnees or with Mingos as they also arrive in the area. But for the Delawares especially, these western Delawares who come over and reestablish themselves on this side of the mountains, they bring with them a certain mindset. Okay, Pennsylvania had no Indian war for most of its history. It's very unique among the 13 colonies. Almost any other colony you look at, it's not that long after the establishment of the colony that fighting with Indians breaks out. Pennsylvania's established in the 1680s. There's no Indian war until 1755. 70 years without a conflict. Part of that is the policies of William Penn. Part of that is the Delaware peoples who favor negotiation over violence for the most part. But these ones who come here to the west bring with them or develop a certain militant attitude. And literally, they've been pushed out of one place, they're starting over. They come with the idea that they won't move again, not without a fight. Unlike their brethren in the east, if any colonists come here, they'll be treated with hostility. Right? So for them, this is their new home, and they're much, or should say very much willing to fight for it, far more so maybe than the Delawares in the east. Now the problem is that shortly after these Indians move into this region, that's also when the region starts to grow or gain the attention of colonists, particularly Pennsylvanians and Virginians. For a time, Marylanders were interested as well, but they kind of drop out of the picture, and your main two contestants or main interested parties become Pennsylvania and Virginia. Now, the curious thing about this is that both colonies think this region, especially around the Ohio Forks, is theirs. Virginians believe it's part of Virginia. Pennsylvanians believe it's part of Pennsylvania. It has everything to do with colonial charters and maps, which, of course, as we know, are not 100% accurate at this time. There are maps. And in 1751, the government of Virginia commissioned a map to be made. It's a very complicated map, hard to see a little bit. Here's the Chesapeake. This is Virginia, extending all the way up to the Great Lakes. And it was drawn by Joshua Fry and Peter Jefferson, who's the father of Thomas Jefferson. And the interesting thing about it is it's hard to see here on the map. I'm going to blow it up for you, but whoops. Up here, this corner, this is southwestern Pennsylvania today. Right? What they did, here's the boundary of Maryland in the green. Right? Virginia, I should point out like this, Virginia, as one of the original colonies, has no western border in its charter. It's wherever you run into the Pacific Ocean. There were several that were like that. Most of the colonies that were founded by religious dissenters, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Maryland founded by Catholics, Pennsylvania founded by Quakers, dissenters from the Church of England, the official government. When they got their charter, they had a western border. The British government did not, or English government at the time, did not say, hey, you can just grow all the way to the west coast, wherever that is. Now, you're going to be specifically defined. So Maryland was told, wherever the Potomac River ends, that's where your colony ends. And you would draw a north-south line. Okay, that was pretty well established. You'll see there's no line here between Pennsylvania and Virginia because that's disputed between the two colonies all the way into the American Revolution. But here's Pennsylvania's line, picking up. Okay, and then we see the border like it is today. Pennsylvania's line is defined as 5 degrees of longitude west of the Delaware River. That's great. Nobody knew where it was because it had never been measured. So on these maps, you're going to see it in different places. This is a map drawn by Virginians. So according to Virginians, the western border of Pennsylvania is here and then moves northward in a straight line, which very conveniently for Virginia leaves the forks of the Ohio River west of the border of Pennsylvania. West of the border of Pennsylvania is Virginia. They say, well, no, it's not. It's Ohio. No, it's Virginia at this time. Right? I'll show you why. It has everything to do with these original charters, the dimensions that were laid out when these colonies were founded. Virginia, as the first colony, has the biggest charter. Its charter is sea to sea, and there's a border here that's established basically because they hoped eventually to create a buffer zone, the British government this did, against the Spanish in Florida. Now eventually will become Georgia, but not till 50 years after Pennsylvania's already been established. But Virginia gets a border here, basically from the Cape Fear River in what's now North Carolina, straight over to the sea. Okay, no problem. The interesting part is up here. Okay, for whatever reason, when they did the northern border of Virginia, they drew it up here, basically right almost at the mouth of the Hudson River, and then said, boink, you're going to open in basically an angle running northwest until you hit Alaska, which they don't even know is there, of course, but the Pacific Ocean somewhere. Now, this is before Maryland comes in. When Maryland comes in, it's carved out of Virginia. So that alters the northern border of Virginia. What it does is make northern border of Virginia doesn't start until you get to the end of the headwaters of the Potomac, or the mouth of Potomac. Right? And then it opens again in this pie-shaped wedge. So Virginia, depending on how you would interpret the map, they could claim that the forks of the Ohio River just fall within the borders of Virginia. But the nice thing about the original charter of Virginia is they can pretty much claim that all of North America is Virginia. I always remember when I talk about this, I can't remember, it's been a while, decade more, when you'd go to Colonial Williamsburg down there, obviously in Virginia, they would always have it themed. Most recently it's been themed as American Revolution times, but for a while it was themed as the year 1774, right before the Revolution. And they had these big banners down there talking about the West is ours. And it's right on the heel of what's called Dunmore's War. And the governor of Virginia brought military forces to Pittsburgh, occupied Fort Pitt, renamed it Fort Dunmore. And the Virginians literally took physical possession of Pittsburgh and drove out anybody in the Pennsylvania Arc, so to speak. So I always remember that. I even joshed with one of the costumed interpreters down there. They, Pittsburgh's not yours. It's in Pennsylvania. They, "Nay!" They stay in character pretty good. "Nay, 'tis Virginia." Blah blah blah. But Now, the problem here, contesting this, if you're Pennsylvania, is what I said. Nobody knows where your western border is. This essentially is the known borders of the colonies around 1750. It's just the mountains. That end just borders the mountains. No surveying has been done before the mountains. So this issue of where does Pennsylvania end, because wherever it ends, Virginia's going to pick up right after that. So does it end before you get to the Allegheny River and the forks of the Ohio, or does it end after that? Well, the Virginians had their map, the Pennsylvanians, well, getting ahead of myself here. We know today that that border, where it is, and it's a straight north-south line. It's not spelled out in Penn's charter what kind of line it will be. Just 5 degrees of longitude west of the Delaware River. So you had some people who argued it should just be a north-south line. You had others, I had no idea how they would serve this. There was a surveyor here, no idea how they would survey this at the time. But there were some who said it should identically mirror the undulations of the Delaware River. So whatever the Delaware River runs over here, that's what the border of western Pennsylvania should just be, exactly like that, a mirror. That'd be really hard to survey, I would think, even today. But depending on where you find, the curves of the Delaware River, it might again have the forks of the Ohio River outside of the boundary of Pennsylvania. Now, what I started to say is the Virginians had their map, the Pennsylvanians had their map. And just as the Virginians' map showed the forks of the Ohio River to be beyond Pennsylvania's border, Pennsylvania's, you blow it up here, this is a much bigger map, but you blow this up, okay? Here's now the border. Interestingly, you can see this one shows the western border of Pennsylvania as being the same, a mirror image of the Delaware River. So it's not a straight line. It winds all over the place. But there's the forks of the Ohio River inside Pennsylvania. So both of these colonies believe this is theirs. And as if things intensify as you're moving towards war, they both believe this is their province and that they should be the ones to govern it, to have jurisdiction over it. Now, the Indians, they don't care about either one of those colonies. This is ours. Neither of you need to be here. Right? Now, lastly, of course, there's the French we'll get into. What draws the French, in many regards, into the region is the activities of these American colonists as they start to move towards trying to consolidate control over the Ohio Forks and take up this region. Of course, we heard a little bit earlier about the Ohio Company. Beginning as early as 1740, Virginians started applying to their colonial government for grants, land patents, what we think as real estate deals, real estate titles, around the forks of the Ohio River. And the governor and the council of Virginia at the time started to grant some. There's a guy named James Patton who gets 200,000 acres just off the Ohio River. There's another guy named Robinson who gets land very close to the same place. But then what happens is a war breaks out in 1744 between Great Britain and France and other European nations, which American colonists refer to as King George's War. And the governor of Virginia believes it's risky to allow anyone to actually go out and try to settle these lands during the war. So he says, no, you individual landowners, I can't allow this. You're not going to be allowed to take up your grant. It has to be delayed. In response to this, 13 very wealthy, powerful, influential Virginians formed themselves together into what's called the Ohio Company of Virginia, stating basically that their combined resources would allow them to move into the region with a degree of safety, much more so than any individual land grant owners. It's a way to try to get around the governor. Now, among these 13 founders of the Ohio Company is Lawrence Washington, George Washington's older half-brother, Thomas Lee, who's a member of the prominent Lee-Fairfax family. The Fairfax family owned basically the entire northern neck of Virginia, about 5 million acres of land. They're the largest landholder, so much so that the head of the family was referred to for much of this time as Lord Fairfax, one of the few, if only Americans, who was given a title, Lord. It was something that kind of gets left behind in England, but not for him. And interestingly enough, this guy's older brother, George Washington, this is, how do you say this? I'm not sure how you do it correctly. His brother is the grandfather of Robert E. Lee. So he would be, great uncle, granduncle, something along that line. And then he marries into the Fairfax family, the richest, most powerful family in the entire colony. Now, he dies shortly after forming the Ohio Company. And when that happens, the company extends an invitation for full membership to the new governor of Virginia, Robert Dinwiddie. And Dinwiddie will become, during the years leading up to the war, the main mover and shaker behind a lot of things. The Ohio Company, you could argue in some cases the war, all of it. But Dinwiddie becomes very firmly attached to this. Now, with these prominent individuals, Now you have a governor who supports this idea in Dinwiddie. They go straight to the crown. Another member whose picture I don't have up on here is a guy named John Hanbury, who's probably the wealthiest tobacco merchant in England. He becomes the company's lobbyist, basically, back in London. He has personal access to King George II, who he convinces to grant a royal patent to the Ohio Company for 200,000 acres. Really, it's 500,000 acres, but they get a partial grant first, and they have to settle it within a certain number of years. If they do that, they'll get the rest. But it's positioned right here, basically, at the forks of the Ohio River along the south bank of what we would think of today as the Ohio River and a little bit of the Monongahela. And the company then moves forward to try to take up its grant. In 1750, they build a road. The company begins building a road. It's the same road that Washington will later improve and extend. But the company is actually what starts it and gets it going towards Redstone Creek. And this road this time goes to what's called Wills Creek, where they build a company storehouse. Washington will extend it further under his military command that we heard about earlier. But the company is starting to move into this region. Now, this greatly alarms a lot of people, including the French. Okay? It would be, I think, incorrect to argue that the Ohio Company actions led the French to invade western Pennsylvania because they didn't really know anything about them yet. What was more troubling is that as both Pennsylvanians and Virginians started to make access to this region, in an effort to try to get the Indians to remain friendly with them, to not lead to hostilities, they would trade with them. And simply put, British colonials, American colonists' trade goods were of superior quality in most cases to what the French offered, and they sold them for less. And Indians were consumers, and savvy consumers. Many of them started to trade exclusively with American colonists. Pennsylvanians, off our map, had trading posts as far into central Ohio, Pickawillany, and other places. And this greatly alarmed the French, who started to receive reports back in Canada of Indians not trading with them, declining profits from the Indian fur and skin trade of the Great Lakes. And so in 1749, they sent the famous Céloron de Blainville voyage down the Ohio River, basically to find what the hell's going on. What's wrong out here? And of course, as he stopped, he buries these famous lead plates that we heard about other places to kind of reassert France's claim to the region. But he stops at all these major Indian villages, many of which the French didn't even know existed now because these new Indians have come into the region and established themselves along the Allegheny River watershed. And Céloron kind of misreads what's going on. He writes in his reports that these Indians are wholly attached to the English and that they don't want us here, and we better take action before it's too late. Now, that's not really accurate. They were not wholly attached to the British. Okay, what they were is basically telling Céloron, this is our land now. It's not yours. Get out. And so Céloron kind of misreads that and says, well, they're all friendly with the British. If we don't do something, the English colonists, the American colonists are going to take all this land that France lays claim to. So when he goes back to Canada, he tells his superiors, we need a military expedition. Now, that takes some time to organize, to get approved. But in 1753, as we all know, the French come back down the Allegheny River, building a string of forts. But when you read the French, the line of, basically translates in English, the line of fortification. Okay? And I don't have the individual forts other than Fort Duquesne on the map with the picture here, but in 1753, you heard earlier, they'll build one up here at Erie, one down here, Michaud at Venango, right. Venango's the Indian village. The French, when they build their fort there, they build it literally right across the river from the Delaware, or Muncie, Delaware village of Venango, kind of a way of saying, hey, who's in control? You or us? It's kind of threatening them, literally. But Fort Duquesne, not built to the following year, 1754, will be the anchor of this line. And the French, in their documents, literally do think of it as a line, almost like a wall, a metaphorical wall, with patrols being able to send out between the various posts to keep the Indians kind of in order under the allegiance to France, and to toss out or capture any incoming American traders or colonists from Pennsylvania or Virginia. Okay, this is an aggressive move that the French see as necessary to maintain their claims on the region, to restake what they're fearful that they might be losing here. Now, when this happens, interestingly enough, both Pennsylvania and Virginia have a claim to this region. So they're both in a position to do something about it. Pennsylvania, the Colonial Assembly of Pennsylvania, one house legislature, controlled as it has been for most of the colony's history by the Quaker Party. predominantly Quakers. And Quakers get reelected over and over in Pennsylvania, even though they're a very small minority of the population. They keep getting elected to political office because they run on, what you could argue is a very attractive platform. No taxes, no government interference in your life. Basically do what you want. But at the same time, you have to be willing to accept that if they're not going to really tax you and raise money, and that the Quakers are pacifists, there's not going to be a militia. Pennsylvania, prior to the French-Indian War, is the only of the 13 colonies with no militia. There's no troops. There's no army for defense. Right? So you had to take the good with the bad. So when the French come in force and take the line of the Allegheny River, Quaker politicians in Pennsylvania, they don't really do anything. They argue with each other, with some of them saying, well, you know what? That's not even really ours. The same guys had been telling Virginia, that's ours, not yours. Now are like, well, I'm not so sure. If you use that map the Virginians have, that's not ours. We shouldn't have to fight for it. Virginia is left basically with an opportunity. And there's arguably at this time no greater opportunist than Robert Dinwiddie, the governor of Virginia. This guy is a political climber. He's very interested in land speculation and becoming rich. And he has, as he writes in his own letters, the interests and success of the Ohio Company much at heart. So given this opportunity, Dinwiddie sees a chance to do two things. One, secure the Ohio Company's grant by force, and two, to basically blunt or defeat the Pennsylvania claim to the region. His logic is, if Virginia moves into the region and a fight breaks out with the French, but Virginia fights and defends the British land for the empire, that the British policymakers will rule in Virginia's favor in this dispute, this jurisdictional map dispute with Pennsylvania. Okay? It's risky, because he's going to use Virginia to try to fight all of New France, basically. But he's willing to take that risk. Now, there are rules of war, whether anybody wants to follow them or not. For much of recorded history, there have been at least some form of rules of warfare. And at this time, the rules of warfare required that Dinwiddie, prior to opening any hostilities with the French, must send somebody as a diplomat to give the French a warning. Basically, as we've heard earlier, this is our territory, the British territory. Remove yourselves from the Allegheny River or face war, face hostilities. That guy, as we've heard, is George Washington. We had a nice job covering that earlier, so I don't really need to dwell on it much. I'll just throw this in, because I've heard this before, and it struck me as being interesting. Once a guy named John Furling, who's a very established historian, or was. I'm not sure if he's still with us, honestly, but big George Washington scholar. He said that Dinwiddie picked Washington, as we heard about. Why Washington? Okay? One of the reasons, in addition to what we were given earlier, is he picked Washington because he was expendable. Okay? For this kind of office, to be a diplomat with the standing, to be respected, you couldn't just be anybody. You had to be somebody from a decent social circle with some kind of clout in Virginia. But you're not going to take a member of the Fairfax family, the richest family in the colony, because there's a very real possibility that this person's never coming back when you send them out to meet the French in the winter, to go 500 miles over the mountains, through the woods, and down the lake to Frenchie's house we go, right? It's going to be very difficult. You might not die. You might die. And of course, we know Washington very well could have. Gets shot at by Indians, almost drowns in the river. Very different history, maybe, if he never makes it back. We're talking about something different right now. So it's always struck me, he picks Washington because he has enough status from his family, but not too much, so that if he doesn't come back, Dinwiddie's not going to get a lot of flack. He's not going to get a lot of pushback. And of course, don't forget, Washington signs up for it. He volunteers. Because as we heard earlier, his great aspiration at this time is to become an officer in the British Army, a commissioned officer. And in the British colonial system, the administration, all governors of the 13 colonies hold military rank. And they all have a place in the military. So Dinwiddie had the power and authority to give Washington what he wanted. He could have made him a low-rank officer in the British Army. And would that have, talk about different history? What if Washington had been able to achieve his ambition and become a British officer? Would he have been fighting against us in the Revolution? Would there have been a revolution? I mean, you can wonder about that all day. It would have been very different. Okay, so as we heard earlier, don't beat me up on this map. It might not be right after what we heard a few minutes ago. But Washington makes his trip up to the French, politely delivers Dinwiddie's warning. They say no. Interesting enough, while he's up there, he was also under secret orders from Dinwiddie to ascertain the strength of these fortifications, the number of troops, supplies, all that sort of stuff, and report back, as to that to Robert Dinwiddie. Makes his way back, This is actually, should have come up first. This is on the way up. He sits on the top of what, for many, for most of its history, at least in inhabitants in Pittsburgh, it was known as Coal Hill. We call it Mount Washington. Sat on top of Mount Washington and noted the point down here and it being a great location for a fort. Okay? Except that it's not. It's a horrible spot for a fort. But he's going to think it's great, which will also lead him into some problems at Fort Necessity with where he picks to make his stand, which is also a really bad location if you're going to fight somebody to build a little stockade. Right? Now, we get that came up first. You've heard earlier about Washington. He goes back to Virginia, then he gets appointed to rank, but in the Virginia provincial forces, not in the British Army. But he's sent back with that expeditionary group, winds up running afoul, getting into a scrape of Indians at Jumonville Glen. Your picture, by the way, is way better than mine of that. I'm jealous of that picture of Jumonville Glen. It's a better shot. But that, of course, leads to French retaliation at Fort Duquesne. And Eric did a great job covering that. As he said, not supposed to be a fort. That's why it's called Fort Necessity, because he writes in his letter, out of necessity I shall build this stockade. It was just basically a forward camp while he waited for the main army to be brought up. Washington, if that wasn't bad enough, Washington, finds out the French are coming to attack him here, French and their Indian allies, and then around the same time, he gets a report that the commander of the main British army got killed, thrown off his horse, broke his neck. Your reinforcements aren't coming. Oh, by the way, you're in charge. Good luck. And then we know it doesn't go very well for him at Fort Necessity. And the question was asked by, about filling up with water. A thunderstorm erupted in the early afternoon, and yes, because it's in a depression, you'll see a lot of, go back to Robert Griffin's drawing here, where they're massing outside the stockade, you see all the groundwater. It was very wet. And then Washington, 22 years old, no real military experience, he did not clear the ground beyond the range of musket fire, which allowed the French and the Indians to stay behind the trees and shoot from cover. That's like military basic training 101. If you're going to build a fort, you clear the ground beyond the range of firing so your enemy can have no cover or no succor as they're trying to shoot at you. They have to be out in the open. You're the one who has cover, either behind little earthworks or log walls or whatever it is. But he doesn't do that. And then, of course, like the same thing as what he says about the point. He has this strange fascination at this time with loving areas that are on the low ground rather than the high ground. That's why he puts his fort here. He says the point is a great place to put a fort. It is for commanding the rivers. There's no doubt about that. But anybody gets any kind of guns up on top of Mount Washington, you're finished. You have no chance. So, he doesn't seem to like the high ground. He learns, though. He's inexperienced, very inexperienced here. He'll learn, fortunately for us, as he goes forward. Now, in the aftermath, of course, of the defeats at the defeat at Fort Necessity, Washington will return. But when that letter, that surrender document you heard about earlier, that Washington unwittingly signs, he'll claim for most of his life that he didn't know what it said, or that he was, actually what he claims is that his interpreter misinterpreted it to him. Washington, for a long time, some historians have argued he had a hard time wanting to admit that he couldn't read what it said because he didn't know how to read French. And if you were of the elite of society, the educated, the wealthy, you were supposed to be able to read French. And he couldn't. So he kind of hid that, or at least that's one interpretation of what goes on here, is he wanted to hide that, not let anybody know that he couldn't read French. So he blames it on his interpreter. He misinterpreted it to me. He didn't tell me what it said. And he kind of throws him under the bus with this thing. Well, that document goes all the way back, eventually, to Paris, where it's sent with a diplomatic attaché to London. Let's think about what would happen today. Jumonville, as it turns out, the guy who half-king sunk his tomahawk into his skull, was a diplomat. He was coming under a diplomatic party to do the same thing Washington had done the year before. Tell the Virginians you're on French territory, get out, or face war. You're not supposed to kill diplomats. They're supposed to be safe from hostility. Washington signs a thing, says, yeah, I killed him. And we killed him. So the French, when they get that, it goes to London with their ambassador, basically, and he says, we want satisfaction. We want you to do something. What they wanted was the British government to give up all claims to these lands as recompense for the murder of the diplomat. Instead, what they find is that much of the British government by this time had fallen under a very bellicose political faction of Lord Halifax and the Duke of Newcastle, who hated the French, were not particularly happy with the way the previous war had ended, King George's War in 1748, and were kind of looking for any reason to fight the French again. Well, here come the French saying, hey, we want satisfaction. You want satisfaction? How about a war? That's where you get the thing, this guy, this Virginian in the backwoods of America, unknowingly fired a shot and started a war, set the world on fire. Because The French won't get what they want. Instead, what they'll get is a war. And as we heard, you have Edward Braddock here, who sent in 1755. Among his various objectives is to try to capture Fort Duquesne. Washington winds up attaching himself to the general, as a volunteer, an aide. Why does he do that? Because here's another guy. A major general can appoint anyone an officer in the British Army. He can give Washington what he wants again. Of course, we heard how that goes. It winds up very, very bad. Braddock is crushed at the Battle of the Monongahela. George Washington actually plays a major role in extricating the survivors out of that when he's the only one kind of literally left standing. Eric talked about how he's never hit. His horse is shot from under him, holes in his foot. Same thing happens, by the way, in the American Revolution. Several hats shot off his head, holes in his boot, holes in his clothing, horses shot out from under him, never wounded once in his life. Which you can chalk up to divine providence, perhaps, maybe. Odawa, or Ottawa Indians who fought with the French at the Battle of the Monongahela said that George Washington was a demon, basically. They said he was magic. He could not be killed. I will struggle to pronounce it, but they had a word for him, a name, basically means unkillable. He cannot be killed. Because they swear they would have taken him out several times and just couldn't get the job done. But whether it's fate, luck, providence, like I said, he managed to go his whole career, never once gets really wounded. So probably good for our country, maybe not so good for some of his opponents. Now, circle back to this, okay? The war is starting. Right? The two largest colonies of the 13 colonies, in terms of population and wealth, or gross national product, if you want to think that, their economies, Virginia number 1, Pennsylvania number 2. When the British set out to fight this war against the French, they expect their 13 colonies to pick up a lot of the expenditures, add troops, supplies for the fighting in North America. Turns out that doesn't happen really quite the way the British expected, particularly with regard to Pennsylvania and Virginia. And a lot of the reason will be because both colonies will attach conditions to their assistance. And what is that condition? They say basically to the British generals, you want us to help you? You want us to give you money? You have to then guarantee that if I'm a Pennsylvanian, you have to guarantee Virginia does not get the Ohio Forks when this is all said and done. Well, if you're Virginians, you have to say, no, you can't let Pennsylvania have this. And I'm just going to give you a snippet of some of this. It really comes into play during the Forbes campaign in 1758. Right? Several years after Braddock's defeat, the British realized that they need to get Pennsylvania and Virginia more actively involved in the war. To do that, they need to stop this disastrous cycle of Indian attacks that are coming from west of the mountains, especially in Pennsylvania, but also to a certain degree in parts of Virginia. They believe, not quite accurate, but with some validity to it, they believe that the French are orchestrating it all from Fort Duquesne. So they decide to reorganize another expedition to drive the French out of Fort Duquesne with the hope that it will bring the Indian Wars to a stop. Then Pennsylvania and Virginia can get more involved with supporting the British war effort along the Canadian border. The guy who gets charge of this, General John Forbes. Forbes comes into, unlike Braddock, who came into Virginia, Forbes will establish himself in Philadelphia. Now, initially, when you read Forbes' papers, we talk about this, he's going to go this way. When you originally read his reports to his superiors, he said, it's my desire to use the Braddock Road. He was going to come over to Shippensburg, cut down to Frederick, Maryland, and then pick up the Braddock Trail along Wills Creek. And he said, that's the way I'm going to go. But while he's in Philadelphia, he is, from his own writings, he is fairly regularly approached by prominent Pennsylvanians, including Edward Shippen, whom Shippensburg is named after, and Richard Peters, who was the secretary of the Pennsylvania Land Office. And this is a comment that that Forbes says they told him. He says, there exists a great and good wagon road through this province, Pennsylvania, on which are Harris Ferry, the towns and forts of Carlisle and Shippensburg, the magazine at McDowell's Wills, Forts Loud and Littleton. To this valley, there's an easy access from the Ohio by several good passes in the mountains. So in other words, they're saying, Forbes, don't go down the Braddock Road, man. Don't bother with that. We've got a great way through Pennsylvania. It's easy, piece of cake. You'll be at the Ohio Forks in no time. It's a lie, but it's not the truth. But it's a way basically of saying, if you're going to build a road, if you think about it, when the war is over, who's going to use that road? Settlers. So if you're going to build a road, General, build it through Pennsylvania. So Pennsylvania settlers are the ones who can use that road and reach the Ohio Forks and populate it before these guys from the south try to do it. Now, Forbes will eventually, go the Pennsylvania route. He'll decide to go the Pennsylvania route. which, goes through this way. Where's my quote? Okay, there it goes. He writes shortly after, that quote, I stay there, shortly after that quote I just gave you saying, or telling you that the Pennsylvanians telling Forbes there's a great route, all of a sudden in Forbes' writings, he's always about, I'm going to pick up the Braddock Road, I'm going to improve the Braddock Road, I'm going to go the Braddock route. All of a sudden he writes to William Pitt, his boss, the new prime minister back in England, he says, I'm in the hopes of finding a better way over the Allegheny Mountains than that from Fort Cumberland, which General Braddock took. So the Pennsylvanians' influence seems to be paying off. Forbes never really tells us specifically in his writings that have survived if he really changed his mind because the Pennsylvanians were beseeching him to or not. But he does change his mind from the original plan, which was to go by way of the Braddock's Road, to now I'm going to cut a new road. I'm looking to cut a new road through Pennsylvania. Now the reality is both routes pose a tremendous amount of difficulty. And when you look at the Braddock Road, one of the biggest problems for an army is that there are 3 major river crossings. There's no bridges, obviously, and to portage your army across, your wagons, they're going to drag artillery with them, very, very difficult. Another major issue that Forbes brings up and some of his subordinate officers bring up about the Braddock route is they're worried about a lack of forage for their animals, that there's not going to be enough forage for the animals to sustain themselves. And they talk about there's 3 years of growth that has to be cleaned out. To me, I'd kind of discount that one because 3 years of undergrowth versus cutting a road that never ever existed before, I'll take the undergrowth, probably a little easier. The Pennsylvania route's not that simple either. River crossings are a much easier equation, but the problem with Pennsylvania is you have to cross Allegheny Ridge and the various, other ridge lines of it, the whole ridge and valley system. You have to get over Chestnut Hill, you got to get over Laurel Ridge, and that's much harder than going to Braddock Road. That's something that Shippen and Richard Peters of Pennsylvania seem to have left out when they talked to him. It's easy, we just go all these passes through the mountains, except the mountains don't go. Forbes wants to go east to west. The mountains run basically southeast to northwest with ridges between them, which means you got to go over the ridge, through the valley, over the ridge, through the valley, over the ridge, through the valley. Peters and Shippen kind of left that little detail out. That didn't matter, apparently. But Forbes is going to go their way. Now, when he makes that decision, it sets off, kind of a whole hellstorm, if you will. Now, he tells Henry Bouquet, his subordinate, in July, he says, I want you to continue to make further trials, for I should be sorry to be obliged to pass by Fort Cumberland. So by the middle of July, he's clearly made up his mind, because he's telling Bouquet, who's in charge of the advanced elements, find a way over the mountains in Pennsylvania. We're not going back down to the Braddock Road at Fort Cumberland. I'm just not doing it. Now from here you start to see, right in the middle of this war, you start to see this Pennsylvania-Virginia animosity cropping back up in full force, because Forbes will have Pennsylvania militia with him, and he'll have Virginia militia with him. Virginia militia commanded by none other than George Washington. And you'll start to see from the official letters, an argument breaks out about the road and which way to go. And a lot of that arguing takes place between George Washington and Henry Bouquet, the second in charge to General John Forbes. Now Bouquet writes a letter to Forbes around this same time that Forbes tells him, we're going over the mountains in Pennsylvania, that's it, that's my decision. He says, all the letters I see from Virginia are filled with nothing but the impossibility of finding a passage across Laurel Hill and the ease of going by Braddock's Road. So the Pennsylvanians are telling him, hey, you got to go over the mountains, it's easy, Braddock's Road sucks. The Virginians are telling him, hey, you can't, no way, you never get over those mountains, they're too rough, you got to go by Braddock's Road, it's the best route, he's already done it. Okay? Bouquet very astutely says, this is a matter of politics between one province and another. Neither of them seems to care about what's actually best for the army or the easiest route. It's about what's going to benefit them the most when this is all over. Now, here is a letter to Washington from John Kirkpatrick, the Secretary of the House of Burgesses. He says, the invariable attention indefatigably pursued by the Pennsylvanians without regard to the common interest. I love that. He says, the Pennsylvanians are lying. They don't care about what happens to the army. No, but not us Virginians. We're telling the truth. And without regard to the common interest for advancing their private fortune has long been proofs of a selfish and sordid principle, which will ever prevail to obstruct the generous attempts of their associates for liberty and property. That's a mouthful. Which he's saying, hey, we're the ones who are right here. We're the ones who are trying to do the right thing. It's these damn Pennsylvanians. They're trying to upset everything. And that seems to really heavily influence Washington, what you'll see what he talks about here in a little bit here. Okay? And at the same time, the Pennsylvanians are not ignorant of what Virginia is trying to do, and they basically say, hey, they're trying to get Forbes to change his mind. We got to up the ante. Because this here is James Young. He's a member of the Pennsylvania militia officer to Richard Peters, Secretary of the Pennsylvania Land Office. It's a pretty important position in the Pennsylvania colonial government. He says the Virginians are making great interest that our route be by Fort Cumberland. That's the Braddock Road. But I hope they will not succeed. He's a little bit worried they might be able to convince Forbes to change his mind. All right, so these two sides very much interested in their own self-interest as opposed to what's really best for the Army. Forbes finally, towards the end of July, lays down the hammer a little bit. He says, as I disclaim all parties myself, in other words, I'm not getting in the middle of this dispute between Pennsylvania and Virginia, should be sorry that they were to creep in amongst us. He says, this should never happen. Should be what's good for the empire, what's good for the military. You shouldn't have this, infighting between these provinces creeping into our decision-making process. He says, I cannot conceive what the Virginia folks would be at. So you can see who he sides with. He sees Virginians as the problem rather than the Pennsylvanians. For me, it appears to be them, the Virginians, and them only, that want to drive us into the road by Fort Cumberland. No doubt in opposition to the Pennsylvanians who by the Raystown Path or road would have a better, nigher communication to the Ohio. So he says, you're not fooling me. I know what this is about. Okay, you want me to go, you Virginians want me to take Braddock's Road, so when the war is over, you have direct access to the Ohio forks and your rivals, the Pennsylvanians, don't. Now, Pennsylvanians are doing the same thing, but apparently Virginians must have been a little more aggressive, a little bit more annoying, because they're the ones who get under Forbes' skin to the point where he sides against them with the Pennsylvanians. Now, in terms of the actual road, go back to, I told you it will be run through Pennsylvania. Washington, at this point, basically loses it in a lot of ways. He just comes almost unhinged when he realizes Virginia is not going to win this argument. He says, what has been said relative to the two roads, it appears, I think, very clearly that the old one, the Braddock Road, is better than the other can be made, and there's no room to hesitate. He goes, I have nothing to fear for the general service and no hopes of advantage. And I'm not motivated by any private interest or sinister views. Okay, George, nice try, but that's not quite really the truth, now is it? And where's my other quote on here, where he's starting to betray his emotions a little bit. Yeah, this is just after Bouquet summons Washington to a meeting where he kind of lays down the law on him and says, enough, we're going over the mountains of Pennsylvania. So he writes to the House of Burgesses, Washington says, I'm just returned from a conference with Colonel Bouquet. I find him fixed, I think I may say unalterably fixed, to lead you by a new way to the Ohio. If Colonel Bouquet succeeds in this point with the general, all is lost. All is lost indeed. What's lost? The war or Virginia's chance to take control? Our enterprise. What are you talking about, Virginia? Our enterprise will be ruined. And then he goes on, oh, by the way, I'm uninfluenced by prejudice, having no hopes or fears but for the general good. Again, okay, George, not quite true. Okay, this is very much a source of consternation. Now, George will fall into line eventually. The Virginia government, not so much, but George will fall into line and be a good soldier. Here's just a final thing here, Forbes to Bouquet after that meeting. I told you what George said after the meeting. This is what Forbes tells his boss, Bouquet tells his boss. He says, from a very unguarded letter of Colonel Washington that accidentally fell into my hands. This, go back here for a second. This quote I just read you, this is to a guy named Francis Halkett. He actually turns the letter over to Bouquet. So Bouquet knows exactly what Washington's been up to and what he's arguing for. So he says, my very unguarded letter, Colonel Washington, that accidentally fell in my hands, I am now at the bottom of their scheme against this new road, a scheme that I think was a shame for an officer to be concerned in. All right, but in fairness to George, he will, at the end, fall into line and do what he's told and lead the army, as we heard earlier, along the way, including battle at Fort Ligonier, where he almost gets killed by friendly fire, as we heard earlier, and then be in among the van that comes up on Coal Hill and overlooks the ruins of Fort Duquesne. Once the French realize we can't beat this army and they detonate it and blow up, Washington's among the first troops that appear on Coal Hill looking down at the point, and that's why it's called Fort Mount Washington today. Now, the aftermath of this is arguably just as important as all of this. Right? George Washington, he will say that all I ever wanted to do was serve my country, my colony. Okay? But that laudable ambition is no more. It's dwindled into ease, sloth, and fatal inactivity. In a word, all is lost. When will our injured country pass by such abuses? Okay? I hope not. Rather let a full representation of this manor go to the king. He wants Virginia now. He said, Forbes shut us down. Let's go over his head. Let's go to the king. And let the king decide whether the forks of the Ohio should fall to Virginia or Pennsylvania. And then he goes on to, Washington to the new governor of Virginia, Francis Fauquier. He says the Pennsylvanians whose interest present and future it was to conduct the expedition through their own government, and along the way, because it secures their frontiers and makes trade thereafter good for them. He said the Pennsylvanians prejudiced the general against us. He said, they poisoned Forbes against us. It's all their fault. They stole what should rightfully be ours. Right? Now, in the aftermath, another quote, 2 more quotes that I thought I had up here. Right? This is the Pennsylvanians talking about Washington. Even though he falls into line, they say the Virginians are much chagrined at the opening of the road through this government, through Pennsylvania. And Colonel Washington has been a good deal sanguine and obstinate upon the occasion. He's not a happy loser in this regard. He's not happy to have lost. Now, what I kind of misspoke and I want to talk about is once the French-Indian War is over, and Forbes takes Fort Duquesne, the war formally comes to an end in 1763 with the treaty. Okay? Pennsylvanians believe they're in good position to take up occupation of the Ohio Forks. Okay? Virginians don't just give up. They still say, hey, we're going to do it. We're just going to have to play catch up. The problem is the British government passes the Proclamation of 1763, which says nobody is allowed on the other side of the mountains. Right? Nobody can go over there. It's going to be held back temporarily. That's what a lot of people always forget about the Proclamation of 1763. It has right in the words, temporary. Temporarily restrained for the inhabitation of the Indians. And that makes Pennsylvanians and Virginians pissed off when that comes about. So much so that they both, for a short time, wind up kind of not directly allied with each other, but working towards the same end, separately, but towards the same end, which is to get this line overturned, which they do. In 1768, the Treaty of Fort Stanwix, a new line is drawn. Right? It's not perfect, but it brings all this area south of the Ohio River and east of the Ohio River is now opened for settlement. And settlers from both colonies start pouring in. Along what? Along the two roads. And then as they settle, they actually create separate zones of settlement, with Pennsylvania largely settling in the area out east, all the way towards down and through what's now Greensburg, and Virginians to the south through Washington and Fayette, what's now Washington and Fayette County, especially along the Monongahela River. And Pittsburgh becomes like a hot potato, where the little log cabin town of Pittsburgh is very small until about 1810, becomes kind of a hot potato, jockeyed or bandied back and forth between either side, depending on who's in a position of power in the region. Interesting thing about Pittsburgh at this time is that the Penn family, if their claim, one of the reasons Virginia fights so hard to make sure Pittsburgh becomes theirs, is if the Penn family, or if Pennsylvania wins its claim, the Penn family would actually take all of what we now think of as Pittsburgh. And they did for a time. The Pennsylvania land policy that William Penn created said that nobody could obtain land from the Indians except himself, his heirs, or their appointed agents. Now, a lot of that authority had passed to the Pennsylvania Assembly by the time we get to the 1750s, but there's still one thing that remained of William Penn's original policy, and it was what were called proprietary manors. In other words, any time land was ceded, which happened in 1768 with the Treaty of Fort Stanwix, the Penn family had the right to 10% of the total land, and they had first pick. So when the Treaty of Fort Stanwix is enacted, the Penn family sends a surveyor out, and he lays off the land between the Allegheny and the Monongahela River for the Penn family manor of Pittsburgh. The Penn family originally owns everything between the two rivers in Pittsburgh. It's theirs. And they don't lose it during the Revolution either. They just agree to sell it. So they start selling it in the 1790s. But the original, I always tell my students this, because I say, everybody ever drive in downtown Pittsburgh? Why are the streets not nicely laid off in a grid system like most other major cities? Instead, you've got this one that collides with the other one at a weird angle, and then the one-way streets and all that confused the hell out of people who aren't used to driving down there. The reason is because the British Army started a plan that would have run the streets east-west along the Monongahela River back right after the end of the French-Indian War. But then comes the Penn family. They hire another surveyor, Colonel George Woods. He starts to run the streets along the Allegheny River. And that's the way the street grid is in Pittsburgh now, with ones running east-west colliding with ones running northeast along Liberty Avenue. So you get a mess, which unfortunately you get. I can't tell you the story or the reason behind whoever the engineers were who designed the bridges and the off-ramps in the late 60s and 70s, but they should have been fired. As anybody who's ever had to drive across the Fort Pitt Bridge is trying to get to, Fort Pitt Tunnel during rush hour knows you got 2 lanes going this way, 2 lanes going this way, and they're both trying to get to the other side in 100 yards, and it's a frickin' mess. And it's no better the other way coming out. So whoever designed that end of 279, can't blame it on these guys. Gotta blame it on somebody. It was a mess. Now, I'm trying to wrap this up here, just kind of summarizing things. This dispute between Pennsylvania and Virginia is just renewed at the end of the French-Indian War. It doesn't stop. There's still no measurement of the Pennsylvania western border, so Virginia's claim cannot be completely ruled out. And indeed, when you get close to the American Revolution, Virginia actually designates 3 new counties, what they call the District of West Augusta. They created 3 new counties, including Monongalia and Yohogania, which Yohogania is almost entirely in what is now Pennsylvania. Monongalia sticks way up into Pennsylvania, and the capital of the District of West Augusta was Pittsburgh. This is why I alluded to earlier, the governor at that time in 1774, Lord Dunmore, orchestrates a war against the Shawnee Indians, largely to open up Kentucky, which is part of Virginia, to settlement. But while he's doing that, he sends one Virginia provincial army under Colonel Andrew Lewis to fight the Indians at Point Pleasant in what's now West Virginia, while Dunmore himself leads a smaller secondary army to Pittsburgh. There's no Shawnee fight in Pittsburgh at this time. Why does he go to Pittsburgh? He goes to Pittsburgh, he establishes himself, literally marches into what the remains of Fort Pitt, starts to rebuild it. The Virginians rename it Fort Dunmore. He says this is the capital of the District of West Augusta, which is part of the province of Virginia. It's literally like a military coup or an attempt to militarize and take it by force. I don't care what the British government rules or whatever, its possession is 9/10 of the law, we're going to take it. And they did. Meanwhile, the Pennsylvanians, who are scattered back towards Greensburg, especially under the leadership of Arthur St. Clair, they're firing off letter after letter after letter to the Pennsylvania Provincial Assembly. Do something, help us. Get the courts involved. Do something or we're going to lose everything out here to Virginia. Now, maybe they would have, but the American Revolution starts a year after this happens. And the Revolution is, if you want to talk about chaos in the western Pennsylvania frontier, it's the American Revolution in almost every construct of the word. Okay, the Continental Army under Washington will send a string of generals. There'll be 4 different major generals, or in their office, at least temporary major generals, who come to Pittsburgh to orchestrate the Western theater of the war, which will be headquartered in Pittsburgh. Right? All of them will struggle mightily. This is Edward Hand, he's the first, Lackland McIntosh, Daniel Broadhead, and we've already heard about William Irvine, the last of these guys, what he thinks of the people around here. Okay? But it doesn't even start with him. This is the first guy, Edward Hand. 2 days on the job. 2 days on the job, he fires off a letter to George Washington. He says, we have a set of low malicious scoundrels here who have the lead in public affairs. He's talking about the Virginia leaders, the Pennsylvania leaders. He says, disobedience and the greatest contempt of all authority prevails, because this whole country will be abandoned or overrun by the enemy in a short time. He basically says, it's not even worth saving. We're not going to be able to do it because these people would rather fight each other than the enemy. Now, under these generals, you still have these 2 settlement zones. The primary thing that they try to do is just defend the region. They'll try to launch offensive operations. Those will be a big problem. I'll mention that in a minute. But you'll have either the reconstruction or the brand new construction of several forts in this region. Okay? You see one over here, Fort Hand, basically designed to protect the Pennsylvania settlements. Fort Henry, which is Wheeling, West Virginia now, designed to kind of protect the Virginia settlements. And then a couple, Fort McIntosh and Fort Lawrence, trying to extend the Army's reach into Ohio to be able to strike at the Indians, who are largely the opponent here, not the British Army, but the Indians who get a lot of their outfitting and direction from Fort Detroit, occupied by the British. The problem will be that Hand, the first general, and all the other ones after him, they don't have enough Continental soldiers to man these forts. At no time are there more than about 700 or 800 Continental soldiers in Pittsburgh, which means they have to rely entirely on the civilian militia for manpower. And what they find is the militia won't serve unless you meet their demands. Right? One of the first things they get is, well, if we come fight for you and help you, you have to recognize us as this is rightfully Virginia, or this is rightfully Pennsylvania. Then, even when that would get put aside, these guys over here, for example, the Pennsylvanians, they would say, hey, we need you to come over here and help garrison Fort Henry. They'd say, no, that's in the Virginia zone. No. Right? or we need to draw out combined forces to try an offensive operation. Oh, the Pennsylvanians are going? You're good. The Virginians are going? Yeah, we'll stay home. Right? They very much wanted the militia leaders, and the militias were basically organized by county, under a county militia lieutenant. These lieutenants drove the generals crazy, because they would never do anything without conditions. And it was only conditions that would favor themselves. Right? This is Irvine again. He talks about, he doesn't have a high opinion of anybody, the leaders or the troops. He said, I never saw troops cut so truly deplorable, at the same time despicable a figure. No man would believe they were soldiers. Nay, it would be difficult to determine if they were white men. And the common term that they will use basically is scum. They call the people around here scum, lowlifes, disobedient. General McIntosh, who I had on screen earlier, he at one point, this guy here, he at one point theorizes it might best be better off for the new country if we let the Indians kill everybody out here. Just withdraw and let the Indians finish these people off. And then we can come and start over after that's all done. Now, of course, that doesn't happen. The war comes to an end eventually, but this jurisdictional dispute will also come to an end, but not without some consequences. Pennsylvania will eventually win this battle, and it will be recognized that this area, the Ohio Forks, is part of the colony of Pennsylvania. In fact, representatives of Virginia and Pennsylvania meet in Baltimore in 1780, and they settle the issue. Now, they're ordered to by the Continental Congress. They don't do it willingly. They're ordered to. And Virginia, begrudgingly, kind of with the Continental Congress leaning on them, says, all right, okay. But they say, hey, we got a lot of people settled out there who are from Virginia. What's going to come of them? They have land titles. They have deeds. They're from Virginia. Will Pennsylvania honor them? Well, the Pennsylvania government said, we will, as long as they are from before 1780. As long as they can show deed back to the 1750s or 60s, we'll let them keep their land. Right? Now, they move forward under that agreement. For the Virginians living here especially, though, they're very upset. They see themselves now as being betrayed by their home colony, or home state at this point, Virginia. So Virginia has basically given up on us, left us over to become the wards of Pennsylvania, and they don't want to do that. Right? To try to assuage, their fears, to try to get the local Virginia population out here okay with this, the governor of Virginia, Thomas Jefferson, sent representatives out here. And he said, in Jefferson's estimation, he said one of the biggest fears is going to be that a lot of these people don't have land titles. In fact, most of the Virginians had no valid deed for where they were settled. It's a very haphazard fashion of actually land acquisition and settling, all these different land companies and land speculators competing against one another, even if they're all Virginians, seeing who can make the most money. And so you have conflicting deeds. It's just, in terms of identifying legitimate property owners, it's a mess. So Jefferson says, that's what the people are afraid of. We have to protect them, so I'm going to send these commissioners out, and they start handing out these what they called Virginia certificates. Right? They were land deeds, and the Virginia representatives would backdate them. They said, oh, you're sitting here on this piece of land? Yeah, we'll say you've been here since 1768. There you go. Give you that. The Pennsylvanians will let you stay here. Well, Pennsylvanians find out about it. Their first move is to complain to the Continental Congress. The Continental Congress tells Thomas Jefferson, hey, if you're doing this, stop now. Jefferson says, oh, no way. We wouldn't do that. We've already recognized the Pennsylvania claim. Then he sends a letter out to his commissioners out here in Pennsylvania, and he says, you are to carry on with your duties despite the interference of Congress. I put great confidence in your discretion at the present occasion. In other words, keep giving out the land certificates, don't get caught. Okay, because if you get caught, I'm going to disavow you. And this is the governor of Virginia. This is Thomas Jefferson. Basically willing to, still involved with this land thing that he's willing to, go against the Continental Congress and its ruling, to keep doing this. Now, that will I'm getting ahead of myself. Pennsylvanians, when they find out that this is still going on, okay, this is now into 1781, late summer 1781. If you're a student of revolutionary history, you know your revolutionary history, there's a pretty big battle fought in Virginia in October of 1781. Battle of Yorktown. Okay? The 2 or 3 months before that in the summer, the British Army had come up out of the south and invaded Virginia. British troops under no less than Benedict Arnold had burned Richmond. Virginia's in a bad state. They don't know what's going to happen at Yorktown. Okay? This is, Virginia's calling for aid, for help. And the Pennsylvania Assembly takes up that matter. Shall we send troops to outfit or augment our continental line to help defend Virginia? And they say, well, aren't they still doing this certificate thing out around Pittsburgh? So this is what they resolved instead. They said, if Pennsylvania must arm for our internal defense instead of recruiting for a continental line, we shall endeavor to defend and preserve the citizens of this state from further violence and, if necessary, repel force with force. Believe it or not, the Pennsylvania Assembly was really close to declaring war on Virginia during the Revolution, right before the Battle of Yorktown. Again, what a different world it might be if that had actually happened, when they had declared war on Virginia over where we're, more or less, kind of where we're sitting now, this area. And eventually, Jefferson backs down. He agrees to stop, again, with a lot of input and interference, as Jefferson would say, from the Continental Congress. But these people here, they're still not satisfied. They don't care about the Virginia certificates. They don't want to be Pennsylvanians. So they're left with two choices. Many of them leave. Many of them go down the Ohio River and settle in what is now Kentucky, which was at that time part of Virginia. Especially any ones who had slaves or aspired to own slaves. Because Pennsylvania in 1780 passed a gradual abolition law, which did not immediately end slavery, but phased it out over the next 60 years. And you couldn't obtain any new slaves after 1780. So there's not a high slave population among the Virginians in this area, but some of them did have slaves. And many of them aspired to be a slave owner because that was a tried and true path to wealth. They can't do that under Pennsylvania law, they leave. With my little line. They head for Kentucky. But there's a lot who stay. And what they do for a period of years, for about 1785, or 1782, 1781, actually about 1785, is they kind of make the Monongahela River kind of a borderline. And any Pennsylvania authorities, marshals, tax collectors, militia recruiters, who try to come into these settlements west of the Monongahela River are met with fierce resistance, including violence, by the Virginians settled there. This is from a letter from a Westmoreland County militia recruiter to the Pennsylvania Assembly. He said, they, the Virginians, proceeded to dare us to a trial of their resolution and intention. What had happened is his men tried to cross the Monongahela River. They were met by a party of armed Virginians on the other side who would not let them pass. He said, I find it is out of my power, unless a commissioner from Virginia should show up, to proceed into that area without open war. Right, so here we are at the end of the Revolution, and this is still going on. The only thing, it was so bad, actually, that some of these people, it's kind of mysterious as to who authored this thing, but some of them sent a petition to the Continental Congress asking actually for a new state to be created. Okay, we know it came out of the Virginia settlements. We're just not sure exactly who drafted it, but these leftover Virginians here, they don't like Virginia anymore either, because to them it betrayed them. And they said, we don't want to be Pennsylvania, we don't want to be Virginia, we want to be a new state. It would have been much of what is now West Virginia, parts of some other states. And they termed it, what they wanted to call it was Westsylvania. If you've ever heard that term, Westsylvania. And they said, among other things in this petition, they say, this procrastinated quarrel about our country, this dispute between Pennsylvania and Virginians, never mind that we're on one side of it, they said it has hung us, our wives, our children, and living, and made us easy prey for the Indians, in a little bit more colorful language. And what they're saying is, look, we've been out here dying for decades, and it's your fault because you never made a decision about whether this was Pennsylvania or Virginia. And because you didn't, you've had this contest. And with this contest, there's been no stable authority, no recognized county governments, no recognized militia system, no system for our defense. And we've been out here getting killed for it. Now's the time to make it right, make a new state. Now, Congress didn't even read the petition. Pennsylvania Assembly, when they found out about this, actually made it a law, passed a resolution saying anyone within the accepted boundaries of Pennsylvania who is arguing for the creation of a new colony will be guilty of sedition. What's a crime for sedition? Or punishment for sedition? Death. So they made the death penalty for advocating this. And then they ran the line. They finally measured it in 1784. Found where 5 degrees of longitude was, and then drew the line straight up. Who's left? All these guys. So if you want a new state, you're still living there, under Pennsylvania's law, they can sentence you to death. Now what happens is Pennsylvania kind of buys out a lot of the leading Virginians. When they create Washington County, Fayette County especially, the first commissioners of those counties, judges, marshals, militia lieutenants, they're all from the Virginia settlements. They're all Virginians. So they basically buy them off or buy their allegiance by appointing them to positions of power and authority in the colony, in the county, within the new colony. But that doesn't quite completely end it, because a few years after this, you get this thing called the Whiskey Rebellion. Right? This dispute over this excise tax, this small tax on whiskey that hurts small individual producers much more than big distillers. That's what a lot of these farmers would take their grain, their excess corn, and distill it into whiskey, which could be used for a variety of purposes. Sell it, drink it, sometimes even functioned as a form of currency. Right? When you look at the Whiskey Rebellion, and you really get into it, and you look at where everything happens, right? The violence, the attacks on the tax collectors, where does the group that marches on Pittsburgh, where do they come from? That purple area. They're all Virginians. They're all these same people. I make an argument in the book I wrote about this that the Whiskey Rebellion, yes, everything the other people have written about it, it's not invalid, but there's another way of looking at it. And it's looking at it as it's the extension. It's just another extension of this dispute of these people here, these former Virginians, rebelling against kind of somebody from outside their region trying to tell them what to do. Because in their minds, they've been misused and abused by the Pennsylvania government, the federal government, their own Virginia government, to the point that they don't want to trust or go along with anybody. And now alluding to, I told you, the back of the pamphlet talks about the War of 1812 and what an impact it was on Pittsburgh's industry, this region's industry. It certainly was. But there is a big movement for woodcutters, carpenters, and other, skilled craftsmen to build the Lake Erie fleet in 1812 into 1813. And they recruit down through, about as far as it's really settled is Mercer and into Crawford County. They recruit down through Mercer County and even down through Butler County. It's still a pretty sparse population. You don't hit large numbers of people till you get into these regions. So a lot of your workers that come to build that fleet will come from south and east of Pittsburgh. And when they get up there, in the work camps that the Navy, I guess you would say, establishes along Presque Isle, you get the same crap starting up again. Virginians and Pennsylvanians, even though they're all, by law, Pennsylvanians. It's more of a county thing now. Thankfully, I think it's died away, but whether you agree with it or not, there's a perception, I tend to agree with it, I'll tell you right now, that people of Western Pennsylvania are pretty parochial. We like to think we know what's best for our region, and we don't really like to be told what to do by people from outside this region, especially the eastern half of the state, right? All those politicians from Philly and Harrisburg and all that seem to think they know, but we think all they really care about is that side of the state. The hell with this side of the state. And when they do try to do something for this side of the state, it's the wrong thing, right? That's a very parochial outlook. Right? Where does it come from? I would argue it comes from this, at least in part. That's the foundation for it. We may not be arguing and fighting with each other now as Pittsburghs, as Pennsylvanians or Virginians, but we're still kind of our own world here in southwestern Pennsylvania, as conferred to the rest of the state. And I don't think that's a bad thing, personally. Learn more about this, or you're interested, this is just, like I said, a snippet. It's kind of disjointed because I was bouncing around a little bit, admittedly. I think I told you at the beginning, one thing is I forgot my damn notes. My notes help me stay on track, so everything else came out of my head, for better or worse. But I did write a book on it, shameless plug, Colony Sprung from Hell. I used Henry Bouquet's quote. And it's about, at its core, it's about this Pennsylvania-Virginia thing. Through the French and Indian War, Pontiac's Rebellion, the Revolution, on and on, all the way through the Whiskey Rebellion. You can get it pretty much online anywhere if you're ever interested. I think they even came out with it now in an audio book. If you don't want to read it, you can listen to it in your car or whatever. All right, but I thank you very much for tolerating me and my ramblings up